Hello and welcome to the third episode of Going Into Black History. This episode will be based on the theme of education. I'm your host Liam Matthews.
And I'm Nathan Ivery. We're joined by Bash here. Tell us a little bit about yourself, Bash.
Well, my name is Bashir and I'm a lecturer who teaches and further education, and I've been doing this for about 4 years now and full time. And prior to that, I lived in Holland, and I'm originally from Somalia, which is in Africa. So I've got quite a multicultural background from being born and kind of like initially being brought up in Somalia for a very short period of time, and then moving to Holland and having this kind of like European upbringing, and then moving to Britain and kind of like which formed kind of like my adult years, and in all those kind of three different countries, you know, being black is kind of a little bit different.
So would you say that being black in the UK, I'd imagine it's not as much of a bigger issue as maybe other places, but what was it like growing up in Holland?
And I think growing up in Holland, it was quite pleasant, and I don't think there wasn't kind of like any, at least where I grew up in a really small town in north of Holland, and there were not a lot of kind of like ethnic or people from foreign backgrounds, and there was very few of us. And kind of like growing up, I never felt like, for instance, there was a divide, or there was kind of like a difference between how people viewed me and viewed maybe the other kids or something. And I think that has a lot to do with kind of like how I see or how I identify as who I am. And because of that, there wasn't that initial struggle or anything like that, where, like you said, in certain countries, there is, in America or whatever, or some aspects even in the UK, there is maybe kind of like that divide where, you know, between black, white, or any other kind of cultures. I mean, that was one of the most, that was one of the things I struggled with the most moving to Britain, was not that it was segregated, but kind of like, I mean, living in the central of Birmingham, there's certain areas where a certain kind of ethnic background live, if that makes sense. So this area is like, for instance, is an Asian area, or this is a white area, or this is kind of like an area where more black people live. In Holland, you didn't have that. It was kind of like all mixed.
Yeah. So was it diverse in Holland? Because I know like Birmingham's one of the most diverse places, like in England. I know that, but I don't know around. But
yes, it was. Yes, it was, and it was, and it wasn't, if that makes sense. And Holland do a very good thing of integrating people, if that makes sense, within their own society, within you know, their culture. So, for instance, if you know, the people that are there are usually, the foreign people that are there are usually refugees or children of refugees, or people who cannot live in their country because of like civil war or whatever it may be. And so when people arrive in Holland, they get cultured into or they get brought into society, and so you don't feel like you're a foreign person living your foreign life in that country, if that makes sense. So you kind of
bring you in.
They bring you in, and it's not kind of forced, but it's kind of like subtly done in a subtle way, where, you know, you have to learn the language, you have to do, which are all good things, you know, which are all good things, but because they want you to be independent, if that makes sense, and kind of like start your life and do your thing. And obviously my parents had to deal with those kind of stuff. I didn't. I was, you know, I considered, you know, I was nothing different than, you know, because when I got there I was like 2 years old or something. So it wasn't kind of like that much of a change for me. Yeah.
Because suppose like the longer you go into generations, the more open-minded people are kind of being, because they're being brought up around people, and it's not a different thing. Like in the past, it was probably more of a, these people are new to us, so we don't know how to feel about them. But now it's more of a, everyone grows up with, say, like different people in your classes, or just in general. So I think
it's similar to, like, you know, and it has some aspect to do with it, like how travel broadens the minds, if that makes sense. And maybe an old school way of looking at it is like people see something different and it's automatically bad because they don't understand it, they fear it, if that makes sense. Whereas, and I think that was the main thing behind racism or whatever. It's like people feared that culture, or people
feared the unknown.
Fear, and I think, and the lack of understanding, and as a result, it's kind of like no. That's kind of like, you know, but however, I think as generations go on, I think people have access to more information and people have access to each other a lot more. So for instance, with the use of internet, you can be in contact and see how people live in China or live in Africa, or, you know, or you can have the resources where you actually find out, well, actually, where does all this thing come from? And then you'll look back at it and see that actually all these European countries or Western countries have been built or have some sort of been influenced by Africa or whoever they have enslaved, if that makes sense.
Did they teach much Black history in Holland? Because I know in the UK, as shameful as it is, I don't actually know that much. And
I think not really, if that makes sense. Like, I think the whole thing about Black History Month or whatever, it's quite not recent, but it's more of a newer thing, if that makes sense. Like in the past couple of decades, there was. I'm definitely sure it was being taught, but it wasn't as widely available maybe or as pushed. So for instance, if you live in a small town, I don't know, somewhere in the countryside or something, you're not going to be taught about Black history, if that makes sense. However, if you're an inner city student, regardless of what background you have, you'd probably heard of it, and you probably didn't need the Black History Month. You just learned from your friends. And I think that was one of the things, like growing up in Holland, and it was very multicultural in the sense that, like, we were all there was less kind of like thinking, oh, I'm Black, you're this, you're that. It was more about classism. So it was more about like, we're all working class, regardless of what color we are. What all our parents did similar jobs, so we're all in the same kind of So like it was. So then, as a result, you have got like a common thing. So you get to learn from people. So for instance, like. If I was celebrating Eid or if I was fasting for Ramadan or whatever, people would ask me, rather than thinking about like, oh, I don't want nothing to do with that. People would say, oh, why can't you eat? Or why can't you do this? Or why do you pray? Or why do you do things? And then by understanding that, you know, regardless of whether they accepted it, like, and agreed with it, they at least accepted it and kind of respected it.
It's probably one of the biggest things. Like, if people are educated on something, they're less likely to listen to something and go with it. Like, if they're taught properly, like, about religion, anything like that, then they're going to understand it and not fear it and embrace it more than...
Very much so. Very much so. I mean, I think it's kind of like ignorance is kind of like the root of all evil, especially nowadays, because, you know, there's so much information out there that sometimes it's scary. You don't know what information to take. However, a lot of people find it easier just to kind of like ignore it because they don't have to deal with it, if that makes sense, you know? So, and that's the same thing with any social issues that there are, whether it's poverty, whether it's racism, whether it's whatever, people rather not deal with it and not have to think about it because, you know, then it kind of challenges them, like you said. However, the more people know about things, like, you know, learning about Christianity or Islam or Hinduism or whatever it is, you don't have to convert, but, you know, you're learning.
It's good to know about
it's learning so that you know how to interact with that person, and you know, and that creates kind of like a level of respect and a level of kind of like unity between, you know, like a coexistence.
An understanding.
Yeah.
So that could really help the problem if schools taught more about maybe like Black history, so people had more of an understanding of just other people, so then they're not... Like, asking questions isn't a bad thing as long as you do it in like a respectful way. Really.
Like, I think it's like asking questions, you have to ask questions because you don't want to assume things, you know, you don't want to assume.
Yeah, because as soon as you start assuming, that's when things go.
Yeah, because it's like, it's also, since you don't know it, you know, just ask. Like, I mean, a lot of my friends are from different backgrounds just because, you know, like, and they have lifestyles that, you know, don't necessarily match with mine, but like, we at least have a respect and I understand why they do certain things, if that makes sense. But teaching Black History Month in school, I think it's more important to teach it as history rather than Black History Month, if that makes sense.
Yeah, like just integrate.
Yeah, just integrate. Like, it doesn't have to be like, you know, why does Black History only get October or something?
Yeah,
you know,
so it should be like, integrated into the whole year.
Yeah.
It should be Black History Month all year.
Yeah, just as it is white history or whatever history.
Yeah, like, it doesn't have to be a specific thing. If it's a good mix of what you're learning about.
Yeah.
Because like, really in schools you only really learn about Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks. Mainly that's all you really learn about.
And but then, however, there's so many things. Like, I think don't quote me necessarily on this, but I think the lady I think who made the light bulb or something like that was black or something, you know?
Yeah.
Like little things like that or whatever, that can be, you know, like that can be very important for like a black kid or something, because again it's representation, isn't it? Like you know, with
them as well,
yeah. So like for instance, you know, I didn't have that issue because I don't think I didn't live in a society, or I didn't live in a moment in Holland where I felt different. But then Holland, like for instance, like growing up, I was really into football.
Yeah.
But then the Dutch football team was full of like, let's say, black players, if that makes sense, from the Caribbean and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So seeing certain players, I could relate up like, oh, that person looks like me, you know, I want to be like that person or whatever. But it was never a conscious thing, if that makes sense, where I'm seeking out black people that inspire me, if that makes sense. However, nowadays it is more so because, you know, information is available to us. Back then, like you said, like you learn about, you know, Martin Luther King, you learn about Rosa Parks, you learn about Malcolm X, and that's about it, you know. But then they don't teach you about maybe about the Black Panthers, or they don't teach you about, because they have like negative connotations, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, when I was a kid, I used to learn more history from horrible histories than actual history, because they were too afraid to like maybe say some of the more controversial or devastating stories.
Yeah. Because at the end of the day, it's like, you know, you need to make your own mind up for whatever how you wanted to take it. There's certain things that are really important and to know and about what happened as well, if that makes sense. I mean, I think it's not kind of like shoehorning it in and kind of being like, so today is Black History Month, and then tomorrow we forget about this, you know.
Teaching it because you have to teach it because
it's part of history. It happened, you know, like just like for instance, like teaching about slavery is always a touchy subject, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
You always have the awkward thing where it's like when you're the only black kid in class and they're teaching about slavery, all of a sudden people look at you, where it's like, you know, it shouldn't be that awkward, or it shouldn't be that, because the only reason why it is, it's like we've made it such a touchy subject. I mean, it's quite painful in terms of black history about what happened, but then when you look at the actual reasons why it happened, or going back to, you know, going back in history and learning about where the slaves come from and how they were living, because it always seems like as if they were being plucked out of the jungle or something and brought into like a better life, but like these were people who were living in civilizations that were advanced maybe than the American. They just didn't have maybe, you know, some of the technology, but they were stable. They didn't need, you know, for someone, but obviously the Western world has colonized, and you know that was one of the took over and kind of like did that kind of stuff, you know. But I can see why, you know, people might do it like this way, but I think slowly now it doesn't matter whether schools do it or not, if that makes sense, because how do you call it? People will find out through either social media. Yeah,
it's a big thing now. Like, I mean, people bring something up if they want to talk about it.
Yeah,
everyone's got their own platform now to speak.
I mean, recently, just being a bit topical here, but last week Doctor Who did a story about Rosa Parks, and for the next 2 days after that, Rosa Parks was trending on Twitter, and so was Doctor Who. So, you know, I think things are changing, and I think that was quite a good move on the BBC's behalf, because I mean, I did know about Rosa Parks, but nowhere near as much as what I learned in that particular episode. So,
but I think it's important for black kids as well. Like, there's not a lot of black kids that probably know about Rosa Parks. You know? And it's not like in a term of like, you know, I don't want, you know, black kids to know about Rosa Parks or Martin Luther King and use it as like some sort of like, like, you know, like, it should be that part of their knowledge anyway, just like they know about, I don't know, what's it called, World War II and stuff like that. We all know it. You know, we all know about Hitler. We all know about the Nazis. We all know about stuff. Yeah. But that's because it's part of the curriculum, as it like it's part of just the teaching, if that makes sense. Regardless of what country you live in, that gets taught, if that makes sense. Where it's like there are certain things, you know, that don't get taught, or that are not mentioned, and it's not whether it's out of like on purpose or not, who knows, but you know, but it is definitely missing on underrepresented, if that makes sense.
So like even with the World War II thing, they could teach more. Like I didn't realise that there was quite a lot of black soldiers fighting with like the English troops. Like that could be mentioned. Like it was still a collaborative thing.
I mean one of the points, like I think there's this like I don't know whether he's a spoken word artist or rapper now named Akala, and I think he made one of the points that he made was that back when Britain was, fighting Germany or whatever, or kind of fighting these wars, the people that helped them were the countries from the Commonwealth, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And now it's harder for a Commonwealth person to enter Britain than it is maybe for someone like the Germans, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like a really weird backwards way. But I think it's like you said, that's all, whether it's black soldiers, Indian soldiers, whatever it was, those were not mentioned, if that makes sense, but whether that's on purpose or whether it's just the way we presented.
It's probably just because, like, you talk about yourself, you don't. It's probably like that's what they saw as most important, to talk about your own.
And it's that thing.
It needs to change, really.
And it's that thing where it's like history is told by the victors, so it's like so it's when slavery, for the longest we heard slavery from the point of view of the Americans, of the people who were enslaving people, if that makes sense. So as a result, there's no kind of like connection or anything like that. Whereas now, when certain kind of films or certain people address it, or certain information is available or things like that, people all of a sudden have an openness to talking about it and kind of like exploring it and feeling a different way about it, if that makes sense.
I mean, this might come across as a bit harsh, but I do think it will get better, because the people who had issues with racism and all of that are kind of dead now. I don't know if that sounds harsh, but that mentality is sort of going away, and the people who are being born now are being born into a society where people don't really care as much. So I feel like hopefully eventually it will just gradually sort of die out.
And I think it's important, like, where it's like, I think a lot of people now growing up or something, it's not that they don't care, they care, but it's not like issue. You're not talking to someone because they're, or you're not talking to someone because they're white, if that makes sense, or because they're, it doesn't factor in anymore, because you've all had the same growing up, if that makes sense, or like at least the same reference points, if that. Whereas like back then it was quite different. And I think when we're talking about kind of like racism, like there's a lot of different racism. A lot of people just think calling someone the N-word or hating like people for being black or something, but it's also limited opportunities or things like that, or kind of like saying, well, why are this culture underrepresented in, let's say, the media, for instance, or why are black people not getting roles, or whatever it may be. Like, whether that has to do something with the culture itself, that's something else, but like it's also the lack of kind of like opportunities given to them, if that makes sense. And I think and that can be some sort of like racism, whether it's systematic or kind of like any different form. And it's breaking. I agree with you. It's changing. I can see the people. I can see, and people like yourselves who are quite not, and it's not consciously open-minded. You're not saying, well, I'm here, I'm going to make a difference. I'm going to. It's just part of your. It's what should be.
I think that's how it's gotta be. It can't be like. It's gotta be a unconscious decision.
Yeah.
If it's a conscious thing, then it's almost racist in that way, because you're making a point of doing it. As soon as we hit the point where it's just happening naturally, where we don't have to like look at fingers and going that there's not enough black people getting these roles, or there's too many white people. As soon as we get to a point where it's literally just a good mix anyway, then that will be.
And I think that happens with, for instance, when people are in position to give other people, opportunities, for instance. So like, for instance, if I was in a position, I'd give somebody else, I'd be like, oh, okay, I knew that person didn't get this opportunity because of the lack of connections or the lack of opportunity, so I will give them an opportunity, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So yeah, but I definitely agree with you that it's slowly changing, but then it's digressing in other sense as well, if that makes sense. It just happens at time where it's like the problem is mutating rather than being fixed. So every time it's going in a good direction, it mutates into something else, because like at times racism seems like classism, where, like I said to you, like we're all in the same boat, whereas then at another time it can be really clear, and racism in a sense where, and how people are, like I said, underrepresented, or how people are seen. And the internet is quite unforgiving, so there is quite, everything is out there for us to kind of like make our judgment on. Yeah.
Well, I think that's probably a good place to wrap up on.
Thank you.
thanks for listening to this podcast. The next podcast coming up will be sport. But anyway, thanks
Very
for
nice
listening.
transition.
Very nice.
Brilliant.
Take care.
Thank you.
Cheers.